In today's game, we see someone trying to use Tal's own method against him. Tal's opponent in this game burns the bridges and plays very aggressive attacking chess. Well, how does Mikhail Tal handle that? This game was played at the USSR Championship in 1975. His opponent is Doroshkiewicz, and he has the white pieces. Tal has black. Let us jump right in. White begins with d4, and Tal plays g6. The modern defense, where black allows white to arrange their pieces and pawns any way they want, and then just attacks it. c4, bishop to g7, and e4. White goes ahead and takes advantage of that opportunity to build a big center. He doesn't even have to play knight to c3 first. He can just play e4 immediately, which he does. And then Tal plays c5. So we see the basic strategy black has here. It's a dark squared strategy. He begins by attacking d4 because he wants that pawn out of the way to open up the long diagonal and give him some potential dark squares that his pieces can take advantage of. d5 is played, gaining space. That does open this long diagonal and weaken the dark squares. However, as compensation, white has this beautiful space advantage right here in the middle of the board. d6, knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop e2 castles, and here white plays the most aggressive move available to him, f4, basically transposing into a King's Indian 4 pawns attack, which is really the most aggressive system you can play against a King's Indian defense. Now here Tal plays e6. This is an essential move in these structures. Black has to liquidate some of white's center and open up the e file for counterplay. Knight to f3, ed5, cd5. White captures asymmetrically, and we see he has this beautiful arrangement of pawns in the center. And white really has only one strategy here, and that strategy is to play e5. He'd like to play e5 and just blow black right off of the board. That's really his only plan. Now, black has a lot of potential micro plans, but they have to guess correctly and make sure they get the plan right and stop white's e5 from being a crushing blow. The most common move these days seems to be knight b to d7 to slow that move down, but here Tal plays bishop to g4, basically attacking the knight that supports the e5 push. He's happy to get rid of that bishop because in these modern Benoni-type structures, black's light-squared bishop often has a hard time finding a home, so it'll often trade itself off for the knight. Castles from white, if he goes ahead and plays e5 immediately, then after taking, bishop takes knight, knight f d7, and knight to e5 here. Black has a decent position and a lot of attacking potential. Tal, I'm sure, would have been perfectly happy to reach this position. But instead, white castles. And usually, black will wait until white plays h3 in order to take the knight at f3. But here, Tal doesn't wait at all. He just goes ahead and takes it without being prompted. Bishop f3 and knight b to d7. So we see for the moment, black has successfully stopped white from pushing e5. He's kept that square under control. Here, rook to e1, supporting this potential push was probably a good idea. But here, white plays king to h1. He's worried about threats from the dark square diagonal leading to his king, so he gets his king out of the way first. But that does give black some time to get some activity. He plays a6, wanting to play b5. Notice black has a queenside pawn majority over here versus 3 versus 2, and that works very well with that bishop at g7. So he wants to expand on b5. Often white will play a4 to restrain that. Another good move from white would have been g4 to gaining space on the king side. But he plays bishop to e3, which was a novelty at the time, and in fact in my database has not been played since. Having said that, there's nothing wrong with the move. It's perfectly fine. Move, rook to e8, continuing to restrain the e5 push and apply pressure to e4. And now g4 is played. One of the downsides of this rook to e8 move is it takes away any flight square for this f6 knight. So the threat of g4, g5 would be crushing for black. The knight could only go to h5, where white would capture it, then win a pawn, and white would just be totally winning. So Tal has to stop g5, which he does immediately with h6. Now here, white goes ahead and plays g5. Grandmaster John Nunn suggested bishop f2, followed by h4, and then g5, playing it a little more slowly. G5 immediately turns out to be a little premature. Pawn takes, and here if white retakes on g5, knight h7, queen to d2, This was probably White's best line. He has some space. On the downside, though, the diagonal is open, and Black would have this beautiful e5 square for activity. But White wants to go all in, play very aggressively, and he plays an immediate e5. Doesn't worry about that pawn. And here, Tal only has one move to get an advantage. If he goes ahead and takes on e5, then after fg5, knight h7, knight e4, White is much better. This is a beautiful, sort of an ideal position for White in these Benoni structures. The bishop at g7 is blocked. The knight at h7 is out of play. He's got the pass pawn at d5. It's great. So Tal does not want to allow that. So he takes on f4, counterattacking the bishop on e3. If the bishop takes on f4, the knight e5, this is a great position for Black. He has total domination. These pieces are very well placed. So White goes ahead and takes on f6 instead. Tal takes on e3, and then pawn takes g7. Now, in this position, Tal is down a whole piece, but he has two pawns as compensation, and he is going to obviously regain the pawn at g7 at some point soon, so he'll have three pawns in exchange for the piece. But more importantly, he has very active pieces that can become active very quickly. The knight can develop, the queen can develop, the rook can come over after king takes g7. The knight does go to e5 immediately, attacking the bishop at f3, which retreats. Here Tal plays queen to g5. Queen to h4 was also strong with the idea of rook, king takes g7 and rook to h8. That would have been strong as well. But he plays queen to g5. Knight to e4 hits the queen. Now the queen goes to h4. Here queen to d2 is played, connecting the rooks, and perhaps the queen can help to defend h2 at some point. King takes g7, and now Tal is threatening to play rook to h8 and put all sorts of terrible pressure on White's king. So here White plays queen to f2. He wants to trade queens so that the attack goes away. Now, if Tal is going to trade queens, you know that he believes the endgame is going to be very good for him because he did not like to trade queens. But here he does. He goes ahead and takes the queen, and this leads to a very strong endgame for Black. Rook takes f2, and here this is the move, f3, winning back the piece that he had given up earlier because obviously this pawn blocks the bishop's defense of the knight. And White goes ahead and takes on d6. Tal could take on g2, but he just goes ahead and plays rook to d8, hitting that knight. The knight takes on b7. Now he goes ahead and takes on g2 with check. King g2, and rook takes d5. So in this endgame, Tal is up one pawn, but he has a much better position. Notice pretty much every piece he has is better placed than the White counterpart. Also, this f-pawn is very nice. And is a pawn that can really be escorted up the board and is going to be a real big problem for White. b3 is played, keeps the knight out of c4. But the knight goes to d3, threatening that rook at f2. The rook goes to c2, and there's one more move in this game. So, can you see Tal's finishing blow, the shot he uses to win the game? I'll give you a second. Okay, here comes the move. The move is rook to e1, and White resigned in this position. Well, why does he resign? The problem is he basically has to exchange rooks. He has no choice. The other rook, if it goes back, because the knight controls this c1 square, you just lose a whole rook. So it basically forces the exchange of rooks. But after rook e1, Tal would play knight to e1 check, forking the king and the rook, and that would be the game. So when someone tried to play like Tal against Tal, well, it didn't work out too well to play the master at his own game. I hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.